Hello, Gavin here, welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at synth bass. If you've seen many of my videos, you'll likely know I'm a massive fan of synth bass. And you've probably noticed as well that I do have quite a few pedals. And really that's why I use so many effects pedals. I really love the sound that synth bass creates, and I love creating unique textures using these effects. But it can be quite intimidating to start with these things without really understanding what pairs up for those different sounds. So today's video is the first part in a series all about creating synth bass sounds using a bass guitar, well, various bass guitars as you'll see, and effects pedals. But before we get into how we actually use these pedals, there's a few terms that we need to clear up. You see, it's quite helpful to think about our pedal board and bass guitar as a synthesizer when we're creating synth bass, because ultimately that's the sound we're trying to go for. We're trying to replicate the sounds of Moogs, Oberheims, ARP Odysseys, various synthesizers that create awesome synth bass sounds. So those terms we need to understand are oscillators. So what is an oscillator? Well, on a synthesizer, an oscillator creates the sound. It's the sound generator, if you will. As bass players, we have multiple elements we can class as that. Ultimately, there's the bass guitar itself, which generates the sound when we pluck the strings. So we've got sound, hopefully, tuner's off, generated from that. We can also really count our hands as being part of that oscillator, because where we pluck on the string, how we pluck, whether we use a plectrum or our fingers, that all changes that sound. So that's part of the oscillator too. It's also part of something else that we'll come back to. But then we've also got the pedals that would count in that. For me, things like octavers, where they generate different tonalities, so multiple octaves of what you play, they would come under that. And so would things like fuzz and overdrive. We're going to come back to how that works later in the video. Next up, you have things like filters, which we do use filter pedals with the bass guitar. We've got envelope filters. There's various types of filter: low pass, high pass, band pass. And actually I've got the Ian Martin, what's it called? Optical envelope filter, and that's got all three of those built in. So they're the type of sounds that we could use. We also have things like the Moog style filters. They're a bit different, but we can get pedal versions of these. So it's worth experimenting with different types of filters to get different sounds. We then also have what would be our LFOs, which generate modulation in the pitch or modulate other aspects of the synth. But today we're going to use it as pitch modulation. For us, that comes from phaser pedals, chorus pedals, flangers, things like that. Today we've got both a phaser and a chorus on the board, but I'll be honest, we're basically only going to use the one. And I think that's going to be the double tracker by Demiurge Effects. Simply put, just because I'm a bit obsessed with it just now. It's my favourite modulation pedal, and to be honest with you, I doubt it's going to leave my board anytime soon. It's kind of a vibrato, kind of a chorus. They're kind of the same pedal anyway. One's got the clean included, one doesn't, but without getting into the specifics of that, it's a really cool pedal. So you will hear that in the videos. So for any LFO effects, we're using that. We can also use a tremolo for that, because we can use an LFO and a VCA in an amplifier, which is a voltage controlled amplifier, to create tremolo effects where the volume ramps up and down. And we could use a tremolo pedal to recreate that. We do also have things like sequencers, elements like that in a synth that we're not going to get into those today. Well, we will slightly, but we won't get too deep into how we can create those with pedals today, because we're going to save that for part 2, because that's a topic completely on its own. So before we quit the talking and get to playing bass, talk about the pedals, the bass even, that I'm going to use today. I'll use a couple, but the main one's going to be the fretless. The reason for that being is that the fretless bass can create those portamento or glide effects that you get on synths, where the slide in between notes for the... that type of thing. We can use all of that on here with the fretless bass. So it's really cool for synth sounds actually. We will also be using a Fender Jazz bass as well. You won't be seeing too many other basses, and the reason for that is both these basses use flat wound strings. And this is my biggest tip for anyone getting into synthesizer effects or synth bass. Use flat wound strings, preferably older flat wound strings, because it gives you the darker tone that pairs perfectly with fuzz pedals, overdrives, octavers. It just creates that synthesizer effect perfectly. So that's enough talking, let's get into some playing. So first up, we're going to look at octave pedals. Totally on their own. A lot of people pair them up with fuzz and overdrive for synth bass, and I do that as well. We will be using that sound, but I want to show you how they sound on their own, because on their own they're still super synthy. And there's quite a few guys have used one of these octave pedals to create synth sounds on its own. This is probably the most famous octave pedal out there for bass players. This is the Boss OC2. Not sure which one I've got, which year. Apparently there's differences, but they all ultimately do the same thing. But anyway, let's hear how that sounds. I'll just get my in-ears in so I can hear it too. So, we're going to start with the classic setting for people that do synth bass, really subby synth bass sounds using the OC2. And that's with -1 octave all the way up. Then you turn off both the -2 octave and the dry signal. So you get a sound like this. See, it's just super subby. We can bring the clean sound back in. So let's take that up to full as well. And you'll hear that it blends your dry sound with that. Let's stick with the clean signal included just now. And what we're going to do is we're going to do something that is a little bit unusual. We're going to add an octave up directly after it. Now this is not a digital pedal, this is not a polyphonic pitch shifter or anything like that. This is an analog octave up. It's from Gojira Effects, and it's basically just a glitchy octave up. In fact, I've done a video on this on its own. One of the first videos I did on YouTube actually. I'll link that down in the description so you can hear how that sounds on its own and with a fuzz, because it sounds really cool. But put after this pedal, it sounds like this. So this is just OC2. And with the +1 octave. Really cool. I really like that sound. It's a really cool combination of pedals. And what I like is I can get that growly synthy sound without having to use a fuzz pedal with it. So I can distinguish that as a separate synth bass sound from my fuzz setup, which is really cool. And of course we could add the modulation with that as well. And that creates that detuned effect, which you would get when you stack oscillators in a synthesizer. You can get them just slightly out of tune with each other, and you get this massive sounding. It's the Moog thing. It sounds huge. Moog synth bass sounds huge. And to me, that's a pretty good representation with just 3 pedals. We can bring filters into this as well. So we've got the Carl Martin one. thing that we've not touched on yet with the terms for a synth that really comes in big when you're playing synth bass on a bass guitar is the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. Remember that? I think I got them in the right order as well for once. Now, we don't have that on a bass guitar. What we do have is our hands. We can adjust the attack of the sound, how quick it responds. We can also adjust how long the note sustains, how long it takes for it to stop. Obviously, when we use our fingers, we have a lot of control over that. We can play a note. Let's play a note higher up. And it can sustain for as long as we want it to. What we can do, though, is we can use things like a plectrum, which give us a quicker attack. That's a sharper attack compared to... So we can change up our playing technique to recreate the effects of an ADSR. It's all down to how long we let notes sustain, how choked the notes are, so we could palm mute and get that type of thing, or we can play like that. And of course with our fingers we get a softer attack than we would with a plectrum. And something else you might have noticed is I'm not playing really low. All my notes are starting really from the 7th fret on the E string and moving up. And that's because octave pedals track so much better in this range. You get a subbier sound playing up in this higher register. So I tend to stay up here for synth bass. It's actually quite good for your fretboard knowledge as well, because it means you have to know where all your notes are in this area as well as down in the more traditional bass player areas as well. And now we're going to use a fuzz pedal. So we've got a fuzz pedal that I had custom built for me. It is the wireless bass fuzz built by Bad Penny Effects. On its own it sounds like this. Pretty cool sound. You'll notice I don't have it really cranked on the fuzz, on the gain there. I've got a lot of my clean sound blended in. That's something I can do on this pedal. It's got a clean blend, so I can blend between the fuzz and the clean sound. In fact, I'll link to the video about that down in the description too, because it's a pedal that can do so much more than you're going to see in this video. I should also say, none of the companies that I'm using today have any sponsorship on this video. They've not paid me to say any of this stuff. I just love these pedals and want to use them. Same, ironically, with Practical Patch. All my cabling's Practical Patch. Even my t-shirt today is Practical Patch. But even this t-shirt I did pay for, so there's no sponsorship going on. This is just all stuff I love to use. Anyway, back to the pedals. But what I'm actually going to do is put an octave pedal in parallel with that. You could do this with a split signal chain, using a box like the Wetter box from the Gig Rig, or even just some simple boxes paired up to split your sound into both and mix them back together. There's various ways to do that, but I'm doing it today using the fuzz pedal because the fuzz pedal has an effects loop only on the clean sound. So I'm able to blend between my fuzz and then the clean sound with whatever effects I put in the loop. And to do that today, I'm using the Gojira Effects octave generator, which has -1 octave, -2 octaves, a clean signal and a +1 signal. So we've got that octave up that I used earlier, but then we'll also have an octave down and 2 octaves down. So for this sound I have the -1 octave cranked up all the way, none of the -2, none of the clean signal, and the +1 is about 2/3 of the way up. So that's what I've got set on my clean sound. And then I have the fuzz on its own separately. So I have 3 signals running in parallel with each other. +1 octave that's clean, -1 octave that's clean, and then my normal bass signal with fuzz on it. So when you combine the 3 of them, you get this multiple oscillator effect. These 3 signals in parallel with each other. So we really are simulating a Moog now. So that sounds like this. Which is really cool. And of course it sounds even cooler once you stick some modulation on there as well. So that's the double tracker, the chorus. So next up, I'm going to demo that a little bit further. I'm going to play with my fingers and with a pick, and I'm going to put a drum beat on and have a little jam. So let's get that set up now. Cool, go with that. Yep, I definitely really like that sound. So, ruining my in-ear monitors. There we go. Yeah, I love that sound. It's probably my favourite fuzz bass setup. Fuzz bass? Probably my favourite synth bass setup on this board. I think it's really cool. The two of those pedals combined in parallel, running into a modulation, it sounds like one massive synthesizer. We can also do fun things as well, like pairing up tremolo pedals, which I know I said we're not going to get too much into that today, but just as an example, here's that sound. So there's my bass signal, and with a tremolo. You could set up a much harder chop with the tremolo and get that sequencer effect. A lot of other people do this with a delay pedal, setting up a single note repeat that when you hit the note, in fact I have a delay pedal here, we could use a sound something like this. And you see that creates that sequenced feel. It's got that hard attack percussive repeat that makes you think it's a sequencer. That was actually in the effects loop of the fuzz as well, just a simple analog delay. Of course, things like tap tempo, MIDI clock, control voltage, they all help keep these things in sync if you're running along with a drum machine or with other electronic synths, things like that. Production elements like Ableton, it makes life a lot easier to keep it in sync. So next up, we're going to look at envelope filters. These are not to be confused with the ladder filters and low pass filters found in synthesizers. They are often referred to as voltage controlled filters or VCFs, quite complex filters that create a really cool sound, but it's not the same sound you would get from an envelope filter or an envelope follower like the Dr. Q by Electro-Harmonix. They're very different styles of circuit. It's still a really cool sound what you get from the envelope filter, but if you're looking for that traditional synth style filter, you really need to be looking for a VCF style pedal. But the envelope filter is still a really cool sound, so let's get into that now. To do that though, we're going to use the Boss OC2 into the Gojira octave up. We're going to use that same sound that we used previously. Without the modulation, we're just going to have the filter with it. So the OC2 and octave up paired still sounds like this. Like that, pretty cool sound. But with the filter, it sounds like this. Pretty cool sound. It's nothing like a Moog or an ARP Odyssey or anything like that, but still a really cool sound. So highly recommend checking them out, because it's just another synth sound we can have on our pedal board. What's also cool when we use an envelope filter is using overdrive before it. Not just for envelope filters really, but any synth bass setup, we can use an overdrive pedal. The common thing is to use a fuzz pedal, but often overlooked is overdrive. It's still a really cool sound, but it is also slightly different tonally to using a fuzz. So it's worth trying both, because they're both really cool sounds. So we're going to use that same synth setup, so the 2 octavers into the envelope, but as well as that we're going to add an overdrive before it, and that'll sound like this. Really cool sound. I really like that setup. That overdrive, well, it's really more of a distortion, I suppose, but it's a drive pedal from Demiurge Effects again, and that's the Blackwood. So that's a really cool sound. Really like that. But there's also another type of filter pedal that's a little bit different, and that's using a synth pedal. We see a few of these on the market. You've got the Mark Bass Super Synth, you've got the Micro Synth from Electro Harmonics, and the one today we're using is the Digitech Bass Synth Wah, which they sadly don't make anymore. It's a really cool pedal, but the big thing with this pedal is that it doesn't sound like a Moog. Oh, getting tangled in my ears. It doesn't sound like a Moog or a traditional synth. It's in the same vein that the envelope filter isn't traditional or authentic to those classic synth sounds. Neither are these pedals, but they're still a really cool sound. So I've got it on one of my favourite settings. There's 7 different types of synth in this pedal. We're not going to go through all of them today, but my favourite one is number 5. I've got my glasses on, so there was no way I was reading that. And that sounds like this. Totally different sound to anything we've used so far, and it's definitely one I'd highly recommend if you're looking for one of these synth all-in-one pedals. So lastly, we're going to play a very different sound. This is a pedal that you might have seen in another one of my videos. This is the Gojira Effects Mangler. This uses a built-in oscillator to generate a sound, as well as running in parallel with what you play. And then you have other controls which, I'll be honest, they're so interactive, to say that what the controls do doesn't even scratch the surface. So we're going to listen to this one as the last sound today. It's a really cool pedal. I'm going to put a drum beat on, maybe change it up slightly. Don't know, actually quite like that drum beat. But we're going to use this pedal and we will turn some octavers on and off. The modulation, I'll switch between my fingers and a pick. And I think for this one, actually, I'm going to switch to just my Fender Jazz Bass. So before we play this last sound, I just want to give you a few final thoughts on synth bass for part 1. So like I say, we haven't gone too far into sequence sounds or things like that yet. That's coming in part 2. But I hope from this video you've seen that a fuzz pedal can work really well for generating sounds alongside octave pedals. The two of them, when combined or on their own, can create awesome fundamental sounds for synth bass. We then also have the modulation effects, which when you pair that up with those sounds, gives that detuned effect, as well as the filtering to an extent that you would want for really traditional Moog style synth bass or the ARP sound. We then also have things like filters, but like I said, an envelope filter will work really well for certain sounds. Like I say, that's very similar to the way the Digitech Bass Synth Wah and the Dr. Q also sound. It's that envelope filter sound, not a traditional ladder filter or a low pass filter, a resonant low pass, like you would find in the Korg MS-20 or something like that. So they are a bit different. As well, don't be scared of octave up as well as octave down, and especially pairing the two together. Also have flat wound strings. Oh, tuner's obviously not on. Got flat wound strings. They do make a massive difference, whether it's fretted or fretless. They make a huge difference. And as well, don't be scared to try plectrums as well as fingerstyle, changing up your picking dynamics to really shape the sound. So I hope you found this helpful. Please let me know in the comments what your favourite sounds were, or any tricks you're using to create synth-based sounds, because I'd love to hear what you're all doing. And let me know as well what elements you want to see covered in part 2. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit like and subscribe down below, clicking the bell icon to be notified of more content when it comes out. And until next time, keep working on those bass faces.